My name is Shasheena Rolle-Farquharson. I was stationed at ZNS. I am a television anchor / news reporter, but my official title is associate editor.
I'm certain that it is a little different for you to be on the other side of the camera in this regard. So we thank you, and bear with me as you are the expert. Are you a Grand Bahama native?
I am from Grand Bahama, born and bred in Grand Bahama.
And as a native, I'm certain that you have, quote unquote, rode out several storms. Are there any that stand out in your mind prior to Dorian, and if so, why?
So we know the 2004 and 2005 storms, Hurricane Wilma and Jean, I think it is. I wasn't here, so I was in university during those storms. But coming back home, what I remember is covering Hurricane Matthew. I went to Abaco to cover Hurricane Sandy, and so I've covered a few storms. I can't remember the name of all of them. I just remember, the wind, the rain, the fear of not knowing what was going to happen. But in the end, 2 days later, it's like, we've come out of it. We're good, we are resilient people. And so for me, with Hurricane Dorian, I figured it would have been basically the same routine. You prepare for the storm, you ride out the storm, and you go about life, because we've been accustomed to riding out these storms. So no storm, obviously, at this point, we realize stands out the way Hurricane Dorian would have stood out.
So Dorian now stands out in our minds because of what we endured. So what you would say then is that our anticipation of the storm, our anxieties and fears relative to storms prior to Dorian was about the same. I mean, do you think that we knew what Dorian would do?
The anxiety and the fear in the beginning was relatively the same. I remember coming home from work a few days before the storm to prepare my son and my mom. He was staying with her, and she made plans. She lives on the water. We've lived at this residence for some 20 years, right? And so she made plans really to stay home. She had someone cook a week's worth of food. I think I remember spending about $400 to $500 just like on grocery and snacks, because I'm going to work. So of course I'm stationed at work for the next few days. So we did everything to ensure that, they were ready. She was staying home alone, but we had not alone, but she was staying with my son. We had a worker who was coming up, and he was supposed to stay with her. And so I was comfortable in my mind that they would have been okay. I remember the concerns now coming in from the Met Office, and of course from the international stations. And as I came home, I lay across her bed, and I fell asleep. I wanted to catch myself for a little bit after all of the preparation. And I got up. And as I tell the story, I always say it's like the Holy Spirit woke me up just in time to hear this meteorologist say, he said, I don't know how anyone in the Bahamas is going to withstand the storm. The storm surges, the announcements of the storm surges started from 10 feet, 15 feet. At this point, he was now at 25 to 30 feet. And I instantly got up. And I went, she was in the kitchen, and we had some persons around the yard working, backing up, doing whatever it is that they needed to do. And I said to her, Mommy, y'all can't stay. And she said, why? We're prepared to stay. And I'm like, you can't stay here. And she said, well, I'm not going anywhere. We've lived here for 20 years. We rode out every storm at home. We never had a problem. I don't feel like going, because she was going by my brother's house. She's like, I don't feel like going anywhere. You know, Jaden and I, we have the hurricane-proof windows. We have everything that we need to be safe. I said, Mommy, the way that meteorologists described Hurricane Dorian just now, there's no way that y'all are gonna make it out of this alive. So she started to make noise, and you know, there was this back and forth spat, and I said, you know what? You wanna stay, you stay. I have to go to work. I have to anchor a newscast for hours on end. In my mind, I can't be comfortable leaving my child home. I said, so if you want to stay, you stay. She said, oh yeah, she's staying. And I told them, I said, Jaden, you need to get your stuff together, whatever, we have to leave. And you know, I have one child, one biological child, and so he's used to being alone. He loves to play his game. He's fine with just staying at home. And so it started to be an argument between him and myself. And I said, listen, you leave in. And as we packed up our bags and we reversed, and I pulled off, my mom was in the yard picking up her stuff, and I reversed right back. As we pulled off, rather, I reversed and I looked at her and I said, listen, why would you put your children through this? You cannot stay here. And I don't know if that touched a nerve, because at this point, all of my siblings were now calling her and saying, Mommy, you can't stay, you have to leave. I don't know if that touched a nerve with her, but she was like, okay, I'm gonna pack up and I'm gonna leave. And so that gave me a level of comfort you wouldn't even imagine, right? And so I'm at work preparing for this storm, and it's absolutely crazy, because at this time, several press conferences were underway, and you know, the Prime Minister is making this call, listen, the storm surge is gonna be even taller than I am, or as, you know, he started to describe it. And honestly, I felt the fear coming from him for us. And I'm calling home, is Mommy home yet? No, is Mommy by my brother yet? No, she isn't here yet. And honestly, she made it out in time. So they were stationed in Arden Forest. So if you know Grand Bahama, Arden Forest is one of those areas that's, I would say almost, it's in the Freeport area. Freeport was not set to get a direct hit or any impact. So I was fine. And so I just started about my news day, you know, preparing, and, you know, we are giving the warnings, and we're telling people at this point you need to leave, and NEMA's doing what they needed to do here on the ground. They're sending the boats out to Sweetings Key, and you know, they're making the calls. Listen, you have to leave, you have to leave. At this point, the boats are coming back in, you know, because they chartered these boats to go out to pick up the people. The boats are coming back empty. A lot of people aren't heeding the calls.
I wonder about that, because I am trying to recall myself in the days immediately leading up to Dorian. I'm trying to recall, did I hear and see the Prime Minister when he said that, and it just somehow missed me? Because, you know, I remember a sense of angst and fear. Of course, my position was different than the vast majority of Grand Bahamians, in that I'm from Grand Bahama, but I was always away, either at school or at work. And so I was here this time because, you know, you convinced your mother to leave, and my mother convinced me to stay. Mm-hmm. And so I stayed. And I wonder what the sense was in the newsroom of people's reception to your message. Did they get it?
I think leading up to really the hours, and that's how it usually is, because the police would have come on our news set and they would have said, you know, if you are in the Southern District, you need to leave. If you're in West Grand Bahama, you need to leave. East End in particular, if you are in that area, you have to leave. Time is winding down. Sweetings Key, you have to leave. And so the announcements were made, but fear started to set in, I think, for most persons, just a few hours before Dorian hit. And people realized that this storm that was predicted to be a Category 1 was moving now to Category 2, Category 3, Category 4, and then it was saying Category 5. We're looking at 185 miles per hour or more. Storm surges up to 25 feet. And I think the fear started to settle in for a lot of people. In the newsroom, for us, we said it over and over and over again. You have to evacuate. You have to get to the shelter. But again, if you understand Grand Bahama, we've been through these storms before. And a lot of the areas where people did not want to leave, they felt as if they were safe. You have the areas in East, if you understand the dynamics of Grand Bahama, the people in East End and the people in West End are not necessarily leaving those communities to come to Freeport. They believe that they can ride out the storm. They've done it so many times before. And so even the police officers going on the doors and knocking and asking them, there was nothing the police could do if they didn't want to leave. You couldn't force them to evacuate. So for us, it was only saying, listen, you may not survive this storm if you make the decision to leave. And after that, my co-worker, Ricardo Lightbourne, who was also anchoring with me, when we realized that people weren't leaving, the message moved from evacuating to making an appeal to the men to send your children, send your wives. If you live at home with your mother, send them. Send these persons who are more vulnerable. If you want to ride it out, go ahead and ride it out. But do not subject your children and your wives to what is unknown at this point. And so at this point, that was the message.
I think what is kind of lost from the storytelling is the degree of hopefulness, eternal hopefulness of Bahamian people. I think as people watched, and even as the storm increased in strength, there was that hopefulness that it would move away. Yeah. It would move to the left, it would move to the right. Yeah. It would miss us. Yeah. But it didn't miss us, right? And so now Dorian is making its, slow trek towards the northern Bahamas. I'm certain that in advance of our knowledge, you probably in the newsroom have some knowledge of the extent of the damages being faced on the island of Abaco. So even with all that you said, when you get that news, was that something that you anticipated?
Crystal, we often go to Abaco, but what I think surprised us in the beginning, I think we would have gone on air about 10 o'clock. And shortly after, of course, our coverage is the Northern Bahamas. The storm is projected to hit the Northern Bahamas. But as soon as we went on air, maybe an hour or so into our coverage, we started getting calls from Nassau. And that was unexpected. Okay. So we're getting these calls from Nassau, and certain low-lying areas began flooding. And the calls are coming in. What are we supposed to do? Because the focus, of course, was never really on the central or the southern Bahamas. Correct. And unfortunately, at that point, we realized quickly as we are sending these persons to head to NEMA as soon as possible, NEMA, the shelters, head to the shelter rather as soon as possible. A lot of the shelters were closed. And as people tried to leave these areas, I remember getting we received this call from this lady who was handicapped, and she said, I have nowhere to go. And the water is coming in, and I can't reach anyone. And as the cars were leaving her area, it caused a huge flood within her home. So she was experiencing the flooding even faster than anyone else because the cars were passing through. And the calls just came, and they came from Nassau, and people were like, what are we supposed to do? And so we were faced with this situation where we didn't really know Nassau. We couldn't reach the persons at NEMA, the shelters were closed. And it was, that within itself it shocked us, I should say, because one of the calls that came in, I remember a gentleman saying, he said, if this storm isn't at its max strength yet, and this is in Nassau, please, people in Abaco, in Grand Bahama, y'all do what needs to be done now, because right now we don't know what we are going to do. And so I think that started we started to feel the fear then. And then we started to receive the images of what was taking place in Abaco. And again, it's a helpless feeling, because you really don't know what to say at this point. People are calling in, they can't find their loved ones. And this is hours into Dorian, or minutes after Dorian is passing. You already can't find loved ones. You're hearing about the damage and structures falling apart. And now you're hearing that shelters are being damaged. And it's almost as if, whoa, we are in a serious situation.
Serious indeed, more serious than the likes of which certainly this generation, or maybe even 2 or 3 generations, have seen. You're getting the news from Abaco, and you're thinking, what then about East End at that point?
After we started getting the news about Abaco, I remember, to be honest, thinking a lot of those persons in East Grand Bahama, and I remember telling one of my other co-hosts, Peter Adderley, I said, a lot of those persons in East Grand Bahama didn't evacuate. And it just so happened that I was downstairs as the administrator was making those calls, and he tried, like he really tried. He made those calls, and again, like we said, some people are comfortable within their own homes, and I get it, because my mom is one of those persons. And I remember Peter saying, "There's nothing we could do." And the Prime Minister had made it clear that once the storm was upon us, we could not send out anyone for rescues, because then now you would be putting those persons' lives at risk. And so we knew it became a wait and see situation very fast.
And when you say East Grand Bahama, in our minds, some people see Freetown, High Rock, McLeanstown, Pelican Point, Sweet and Ski, definitely, because the thought there was, oh my God, how could they have made it, right? But as it turns out, with Dorian, eastern parts of Central Bahama were also like East End. They would be, in some instances, complete losses for people, including loss of life. And I'm just wondering, what do you do with that? Because the Northern Service, not just its engines in terms of the technical support or actually being up. I mean, these are people powering these services. And so what are you drawing on? What are your co-hosts and the rest of the staff drawing on in these moments when it is so bleak?
To be honest, Crystal, we knew that areas that were not in the projected path of Hurricane Dorian, when we started finding out that those areas were being hit. For example, where I live, over the bridge, this is a part of East Grand Bahama, but it's not as far east as East End, those settlements in East End, Grand Bahama. And when you say, what are you drawing on? The only thing I could say is God gives you the strength when, I mean, at times when you probably feel as if let me say that again. God gives you the strength when you need it most. That's the only thing I can say, because I knew that when we heard and when the calls started coming in, even from Grand Bahamians at this point, that certain areas were being hit, that people were in the rooftops. I had a cell phone where persons were now sending messages to the cell phone. They were sending WhatsApp messages to say, we need help here. Send help here. As soon as you can, as soon as the storm died down. We're in the rooftop. The water is coming up. We don't know if we're gonna make it. Then I'm getting these messages from my neighbors who are saying, we're in the roof. I don't know if we're gonna make it. Send help. And we live in a single-story home. I'm talking about my neighbors who live in 2-story homes. And so when I'm getting these messages, and even from my family members now, it's coming in, where I would have sent my son in Arden Forest, listen, Sheena, and I'm on the anchor desk reading these messages. Listen, we have to evacuate. My brother's those texts. We have to evacuate because the water coming. And we have to find someplace. And so I'm sitting on this anchor desk reading messages from my family and my friends, from my neighbors. And I'm saying, oh my God, I don't know what's gonna happen to my family, for sure. But to me, I'm also saying, when this is all said and done, I know I have no place to live. And Peter Adderley, who was on the side of me, I said, Peter, that's my neighbor who's calling. I said, this doesn't look good. And Peter goes, boy, Sheena, we have to push. And on the side of me, they were this source of strength. And then Peter Harris, where he lives, is also taking a whooping from Hurricane Dorian. And then Hudson Estate now, and then the people from the shelter, they're calling. And they're saying, listen, the shelters are now caving in. How do you feel? Because here it is, you're speaking to thousands of people. You're talking to people all over the world. We were getting messages. People were calling in. They're concerned. They don't know where their loved ones are. You had mothers saying, I don't know where my child is at this point. And here it is, I'm sitting on an anchor desk saying, be strong, we have to pray, we have to do this, we have to do that. I don't even know where my child is at this point. What am I drawing on? I don't know. I don't know where the energy came from, because at this point now, we would have been on going on 2 days, 3 days. The cups of coffee just coming into the point I'm shaking like this. But I need the coffee because I can't sleep. Phone lines are down. You can't hear from your family. I don't know. I can't say I don't know what I was drawing on. I only could say that the strength of God sustained all of us, even within the newsroom. I had one coworker whose grandmother wasn't doing well at all. You had others who, for example, Roger, he's a cameraman. He had to leave in the middle of the storm. He had to leave work to rescue his 3 children in Hudson. So it's crazy within the newsroom. The studio itself is now flooding. The water is coming up now past, I think, about the 2nd story. And so we were in danger, but we couldn't show that fear.
I think that's something that most people of the public had not thought about up until that time. Some may have still not thought about since, is what you sacrifice as a person who has to serve despite all of the anxiety, all the fear, all the loss, all the trauma that you yourself feel. One of the things that most people would not know is that you and your family had already endured a loss, a complete loss before, right? And so this is not your first rodeo. Unfortunately, usually when you ride a roller coaster, you want to get the shirt one time, but now you've been on the roller coaster 2 times. What is it that you experienced in the process of rebuilding that allowed you to endure loss once again and to rebuild once again?
That's a good question. I remember when finally I would have gotten the news that my family was okay. That was the most important thing to me, because as you would have said, we experienced loss before. In 2012, we had a house fire. You know that you can rebuild. Like, these physical things can be replaced, but you can't replace loss of life. So for me, that was one thing. And my father worked extremely hard to build our home back then. He sacrificed it all. And I remember what it was like. It was an empty feeling because we lost every memory of him. We lost everything that we had of him. We lost. That could not have been replaced. And I remember how difficult that was for my mom. When, after I would have found out that my family was okay, and my sister-in-law called, and I was on air, but they kept calling. And she said, Sheena, your mom isn't doing good. You know, she found out that, you know, the house is finished. It's done. We are homeless. And I remember my heart breaking so much for her, because she's experienced so much loss. Like, she would have lost my father in 2006. Then she lost the house in 2012. And, you know, she was able to rebuild. But here it is, you're experiencing this all over again. My son was just, like, I think about 2 or 3 years old. He experienced loss. We literally were left with nothing but the clothes on our backs. I had a little bag that would have been packed at ZNS, and they had like some little knapsacks, I would say, that they would have taken at my brother's house. But at this point, we would have used up everything. And so thinking about rebuilding was one thing, but thinking about the heartbreak and not even knowing where to begin, I think that was probably the hardest thing for me. And just knowing that, because they came to pick me up, and just not knowing how my mother would have survived, you know, dealing with this all over again. That was, I think, the most difficult part for me.
So you survived the storm, but now you have to survive the heartbreak of the storm, right? You have life and limb, which is fortunate, because in so many instances, far more than we'd ever experienced in Bahamian recorded history, that was not the case, unfortunately. You don't know where to begin. So where do you begin?
Where do you begin?
In the days immediately following Dorian, which I would presume much of it is now a blur for you, as it is for most people who've endured trauma. What was the nature of your daily life, given that you did not have a physical or really emotional home to return to?
Before I get there, I just want to share this story. As I was on the anchor desk, I think this is important to share. So as we are anchoring this broadcast for hours and days on end, I came to a breaking point, literally on the set. And every time I think about it, I get chilled, because I remember on that WhatsApp number, the ZNS WhatsApp number that people were sending messages to, I was reading those messages so that NEMA or the local authorities, whoever was listening, they were also taking the notes as we read them. And they were also taking calls as well. But the call that came in said, these people need to be rescued as soon as possible. And I'm reading it and I'm saying in heritage, so-and-so number, I called up the house number.
I would have included my sister. I, in fact, messaged that number.
Really?
I did.
So you know.
I messaged that number, yeah.
And it's in heritage, and I'm reading and they're saying, Worrell Russell, they can't find him, they can't. And Worrell Russell is my nephew. I broke. Because I know help is not coming. And along with him, I had my 3 grandnieces who was also in that house, my 2 nieces and my sister. And I'm saying this could be an entire family gone. I literally broke. And they always say journalists shouldn't cry. Reporters, you don't cry. You don't get caught up with the story. But this is different because I am the story as well. And I broke. And then my brother, who is an EMT in Abaco, he and I have worked together covering storms, and I know that he's usually stationed at one of the shelters. Another thing was the shelters were damaged and people had to move from one location to the next. We're getting these messages that a lot of people in Abaco are dead. And I'm saying to myself, I wonder how he's doing. And I had no idea that he too was fighting for his life. And so it was just so many different moving parts. It's just, when I think back and think about how I was able to do it, I honestly don't know. And in addition to that, I still don't know where my son and my mom and my family, where they would have gone, because that area was also evacuated.
I thought about that moment on air. I just didn't know how comfortable you were talking about it, so I didn't want to evoke it. So I'm happy that you did, because I think, again, for so many people, there was a sense that you were covering a story rather than you were, in fact, a part of the story in as much as they were. I don't think that people, again, in that moment or in the moment since that moment, really have a comprehensive view of what it takes to do what you and your cohort were able to do on air. And that's why I ask that, in addition to summoning all that you did while on air, when you finally leave the air, when the coffee finally stops flowing. I mean, for one, my first question is: do you float away from the Harold de Gregory building? I mean, how do you get out of there? The water had already. The water
started. Yeah, it started to recede. We were trapped there for days, and thinking back, Crystal, it's so many things now coming to me, because so many people within ZNS left their families, they left their home, and they really didn't know what they were going back to meet. So by far, I don't want to make it seem as if it was just me. I have coworkers from West End, and even though West End wasn't damaged the way East Grand Bahama was, they still did receive damage. And at this point, you still don't know exactly what is going on. Communication was cut. So there was this feeling of sadness within the newsroom, because no one knew what to expect. And so once the coffee wears off and the water started to recede, the first thing was I received that call to say, listen, your mama isn't doing well. You need to try and come. And so I left and I came here, and when I saw it, I'm like, where do you go? I was numb. And I'm not an emotional person. My family often joke about the fact that I don't cry, I don't get emotional. In that moment, I was numb. I looked at her, I looked at my son, and I'm like, well, gotta keep it moving. People at this point are dead. We didn't lose any immediate family members. We are blessed. My brother was in Abaco and he saved so many people. He almost died when we heard the story. He didn't. We are blessed. And I think I was able to put it into perspective so quickly, despite feeling numb. I was grateful.
I think that's true for a lot of people, particularly over the bridge, where you see in the days immediately following Dorian, you saw that those marks on the tree where the water had beat the bark off the tree, and you saw it at the 18 or 20 foot mark. And so you knew, hey, the water got this high.
Yep.
Like the water was this high. And you're forced to look at life as a gift, because there's the realization that, yes, my home is gone. The tangible connection to many of my memories are gone, but I am still here.
I'm here.
I'm still here. And there's so many instances where the stories that people tell in order to still be here, what they endured,
what they endured.
Did.
And the fact, so we have some of those people who died would have messaged that WhatsApp number, asking and pleading for help. And so in a way, you feel connected to these people. You couldn't help them. That's another thing that I struggled with. There was no way to help these people. No one was able to help them.
I remember messaging that number. Well, I remember messaging your husband and him giving me that number, and messaging you. I remember it going out on the airwaves. I remember, Lord, the numbers to NEMA, FEMA, I mean, the Coast Guard. We were trying to call in the British Guard. I mean, just anyone. And I think it's important. What you said is that so much of it, there just was so little could be done about it.
So little could be done.
I think that for a lot of people, or for far too many people, there's a sense of indictment attached to people who stayed or who thought they could ride it out. And what's important for the historical record might be this truth, which is some people stayed in areas where they shouldn't have and they were safe. Some people were in areas where they thought they were safe and they were not. So, while we encourage people to do everything that they possibly can to protect themselves, we also understand that there's only so much
you could do. You couldn't say it any better. Some people stayed, they were safe. Some people evacuated, they died. Some people were not a part of that evacuation list. They lost everything. The storm was unpredictable. I said there was nothing no one could do, except that there was a group of great men and women, because a lot of times we forget that there were also women who went out and who risked their lives to rescue. You have the Ricky Martins, the Billy Rolls. When you start to call names, you get in trouble. Jason and Deshaun Smith. And there's a young lady from Hudson, I can't remember her name. But if you hear her story, you would be amazed. You had people, she talked about how she had to fight the snakes and the centipedes and how they got a boat and they literally almost rescued every single person in the Hudson area. You had ordinary people who risked their lives. We don't always get along as Grand Bahamians, as Bahamians. Sometimes there's this political divide. Hurricane Dorian taught me, though, that despite all of our differences, when your brother or sister needed you most, there were some people who were willing to risk it all. And I don't know if we could say enough thank yous to them I sat at an anchor desk, and some people say thank you to me, but for those persons who went out and really risked their lives, listen, I think about them all the time. I told Deshaun Smith, I said, kudos to your wife. I don't know if I would have been able to allow my husband to do it. I'm not saying that I wouldn't, but when you send him in 185 miles per hour winds, you don't know if he's coming back. And there's so many stories. The more I talk, I just remember everything that we as Grand Bahamians, what we've been through, and we are resilient. We're resilient people.
One of the great qualities of the extraordinary courage of Grand Bahamians and Aberconians both, but Grand Bahamians we know best because we are Grand Bahamians and we were here on Grand Bahama, is that it was ageless, it was genderless, it was political partyless.
Yeah.
It was privileges. I mean, there were poor people, there were rich people, there were in-between people, there were squeaky clean people, people who perhaps had done some things that they regret people, and you found that all of these people could work together.
Yeah.
Some of us did not risk our literal lives in the way in which those group of men and women did. Others of us did other things, but it was almost as though everyone found something that they could do to help someone. We found a place, Every single one. When you hear stories, of course, of, homes being essentially de facto hurricane shelters that people took in their friends and their neighbors and their families, and they took in strangers into their homes in the middle of a storm. Not one stranger or two strangers, but a four person family home is now holding 20 or 30 people. Most of them they don't know. I think that part of the story is heroic as well.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So much of it, I think, is now normative to us. We just think it's like, oh yeah, we did it, and Sister Pat taking in, these people, pregnant women, 7 or 8 of them, having the child born in her 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom tub. I mean, those kinds of things you just really can't shrug your shoulders at in a world where we tend to be so pessimistic at times, so critical, hypercritical of each other at times. I think that, Hurricane Dorian survivors demonstrated that we could rise to the occasion and that we could do what needed to be done.
Bahamians did, all over, because there was some persons who literally rode out that storm with us, who were texting all night, and all of us pulled together to make it happen, to make those rescues happen. Some of our heroes who went out there and risked their lives, they could not have done it without people calling in and saying, you have to go to this location, you have to do this. You have people who were texting, from I went on air till I came off, they were up, sending us information that needed to go to NEMA, that needed to go to our local heroes, that needed to go to the local authorities. Everyone played a role. At this point, we still don't know how many people died, and we could not have possibly saved them all. But I think ordinary people did what needed to be done to save as much persons as possible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes complete sense, and I think it's important to what you talked about in terms of Bahamians, not just in the Bahamas, but Bahamians
around the world.
I mean, they are at their computers, they're at their television screens, and they are completely powerless.
Yeah.
It is like, watching something happen otherworldly, but that this is a real place with real people. What many of the international media persons would have asked me right after the hurricane was, why did you stay? And I always said to them, well, one, my mother, and two, I mean, if the Northern Bahamas was wiped off the face of the earth and I was alive somewhere else, I mean, I guess you think that would be better, but not really good, right? So I stayed. I think that it's important that people understand that, as you said earlier, that all of us are part of the story. And that's why it's so important to preserve the story. If there is a singular story outside of getting that text and making the connection, hey, this is my nephew, these are my family members, they're in trouble. Was there one particular call or one particular moment or memory that stands out in your mind that for all of your efforts that I'm sure that you've made up until this point to be emotionally and otherwise healthy, that you just have not been able to shake?
I think that story would have been the one that we would have received the text message about the couple that was stuck in the rooftop in Lady Lakes. And I'm still not quite over that one yet, because we received the message. The young person, the young lady who would have died, her and her husband who would have died, she would have been related to one of my sorority sisters. And that's where you feel so helpless, because it's family members saying this and so, and if you could do anything, please help me, please. And there's nothing that you really can do. I think when I reflect on Dorian,
and she was so polite. You know, if you go onto her Facebook page, which I did,
right?
Her
went back.
Calls were so nice. They just said, if you could, when you can, You know, there wasn't any sense of anger,
right?
Or, you know, real frustration. Obviously, she must have felt some measure of frustration, but it was so kind, you know, and so understanding of the scope of the storm, and that people were doing all that they could, and they would help when they could. And I do know, in the instance of Jensen Burroughs, who did know them, who did try to rescue them, who rescued many people. You know, he said, I was coming. You know, I really wanted to get there. I just wasn't able to.
That one, it stands out. There's so many, because there's also the story of Tahar Smith, who is a personal friend, like a sister, knowing she was missing at the time, and I'm getting the calls as well that she's missing, they can't find her. That's another one. When you hear her story, I was able to interview her after, and you hear what she endured for days, and you know, she wasn't able to swim, and how she had to climb over a fence, and she had to pull her body up, and how her stomach was just completely ripped from one side to the next, fighting for her life. And she literally fought baby snakes and huge snakes and centipedes. And there's so many stories. And then the stories, even in East Grand Bahama, one of the persons who would have died, he worked for my family business for a time, and he was a young, strong, strapping guy, and I think his mom and siblings perished. It was a family that perished, and I keep replaying it, saying, I know this guy he was an excellent worker, so I can only imagine how he fought for their lives. It's just so many. And then even my brother, who was in Abaco, who, if it weren't for God, he would not have been here today. So many stories. not just one.
And you have them with you. And fortunately, we have them for future generations because, again, in the days after Dorian, your $600 worth of grocery is gone.
Gone.
I mean, again, if you don't laugh at some measure of it, it's just no way to really process it, right? And so, all of your food and all of your snacks, in typical Bahamian fashion, you prepared because everyone's hungry during the hurricane. So in the days immediately following that, like, you have the necessities which so many other people have. You need shelter, you need food, you need clothing. I mean, did you return to air? How long was it before?
I went on. Right after I came home that day when the water started to recede, I came home, I dealt with my mom. I needed a change of clothes. I went by my sister-in-law's house, which was also flooded. That's where they had to evacuate from. But there was, she still had some clothes in the closet. And I put on her clothes and I went right back to work. She had fresh underwear, new underwear, and the only thing that really couldn't fit was the shoes. I went back on air. She's, a bit bigger than I am, and I put on her big clothes and I went right back on air because everyone that was extremely close to me lost their homes. My sister who lives over the bridge, they lost everything. My sister in Heritage, they lost everything. Everyone who it wasn't just us. You know what I mean? It wasn't just me. So I went back on there, I put on those clothes and I reported, for the next few days and until, for as long as I could. And then when I realized how badly my son needed a break, at this point, my family started to make reservations because they needed to get away. And we reported, not just me, Peter, Adderley, Ricardo, they also experienced loss, the technical team, everyone, even those who didn't lose anything went home for fresh clothing and they came back to work. My DGM, my producer, everyone came back to work for days. And I know, sometimes ZNS isn't always given the credit, but that group of people who I worked with, let me tell you, they literally sacrificed it all. They left, I have to keep saying they left their families. Some of them left in the middle of the storm to save their family, and they came back to work. And so it was a team effort all around. We just kept pushing. I don't know what we were going off of, except for the grace of God. It was just, I guess, this adrenaline rush. We knew that the public still needed us. The public still needed information. People still were trying to find out where their loved ones were. We were able to reunite some families, make the announcements that this one is missing, this one is missing. Then people would call in and say, hey, tell their family they are with me, or this and that is going on. People needed water, people needed food. You could come here, you could go there. So the public still needed us at that point. So we had no choice but to keep pushing.
But in addition to that, you sought out survivors and you told their stories. How difficult was it to relive the trauma over and over again?
I think I honestly became numb, honestly. I don't even think about Dorian. I don't talk about Dorian. I don't care to relive Dorian. I don't know why I'm here doing this interview.
You know why you're here.
I honestly don't think, I try not to think about what we went through. And I told the stories and I felt for people and I honestly, I realized that we had it bad, but people had it worse, I wasn't out in the elements. My son was at one point when they had to evacuate. He would have, they would have had to go, I think, in about 4 or 5 feet of water. I didn't experience what everyone else did, but I still I still have nightmares. I dream about water and drowning a lot, and I think that is how it has traumatized me. My sister-in-law said, "What is up with you in this water every time you dream?" I think it has traumatized me in that way, but I don't relive it. I don't ever want to go back. I don't know. You only could pray and hope that we never experience that again.
I know that a part of the reason that you're here is because of me.
Yes.
I
No, the reason I am here, I don't even do interviews. I am here because of you.
Well, I thank you, but the reason that I am here and so many other Grand Bahamians are here is because of your courage, is because of your commitment, is because of your professionalism. And it is important for all of us to understand that none of us are alone.
Mm-hmm.
Trauma has a way of isolating us and making us feel like we're completely alone in this, that nobody understands, nobody wants to understand. And that's a really easy misconception to get when so many of the survivors of Hurricane Dorian are having to do just what you suggested, which is to pack it away as a matter of survival, just to not stir that pot, to know what's in there. But this is not like pea soup and dough where the goodness is at the bottom of the pot. This is stuff that people don't want to deal with, and in some instances don't have the capacity to deal with. Do you think that it's something that you will always put away or pack away? Do you think that in putting it away in the way in which you have, it is contributory to your subconscious reliving that which you feared?
I think putting it away helps me to move on. There are so many moving parts with Dorian. My loss, my family's loss, death, a sense of hopelessness, a sense of helplessness. Even as I talk about it now, I feel empty. And I don't like that feeling. I don't know if it's healthy. I don't like reliving Dorian.
What is it you hope then for Dorian survivors? What is your hope for yourself and other people like you who, for better or for worse, have had to pack Dorian away, especially with the reality that a pandemic was on its heels? And I mean, sometimes it's hard to be grateful, but I remember the one challenge of the last hurricane season where we were in a pandemic, and so it was not advisable that people do the one of two things that we're accustomed to doing during hurricanes, which is number one, getting your supplies, and two, gathering. So now you can't gather, but as another hurricane season approaches, the fear is obviously the weather immediately, but second to that is the layer that we could endanger ourselves by doing the very thing that we know how to do in order to survive. I mean, when you think about it like that, you think this can't get any worse. But
it certainly has.
It's so.
Well, it can, I should say.
So what then is your hope for the Northern Bahamas, for Grand Bahama in particular, that, wow, something has to be different, or some other things have to endure? Perhaps one of the things that we learn is that we can work together, and that, young people who are not so young anymore, millennials, do have what it takes to lead themselves and each other, and far many more people in this nation, that maybe it is the time of the Deshaun Smith, Billy Roll, Ricky Martin, generation. Maybe the time is now.
What is my hope?
You gotta have hope. There's hope is something to look forward to.
My hope, I think, first of all, is that we heal. There are a lot of people who are still hurting from Hurricane Dorian. There are a lot of people who still have questions that will never be answered. They don't know where their loved ones are. They didn't even have a body to bury. They didn't have an opportunity to say their final goodbyes. You have so many people, as you travel east of Grand Bahama, you realize that a lot of these homes are empty. People have not come back. Mix that with a pandemic. A lot of people haven't been back to work. They don't have the funds to rebuild their lives. We really did not have an opportunity to move on from Dorian. So my hope is that we heal, that we find a way to heal. And I honestly, I don't know how, that can be done. I spoke with a gentleman just 2 weeks ago who lives in East Grand Bahama, and he wants to go home. I mean, he wants to go home. If you understand those communities, East and West, those are proud people. They love their communities. If they don't have to come to Freeport, they probably wouldn't, because they love home so much. Many of them in East Grand Bahama have yet to be able to return. You have residents from Abaco who are displaced all over the Bahamas. They can't return home. There's nothing for them to return home to. They're out of work. We are hurting. We need to heal. But then again, you have another hurricane season on the horizon, and there's still a pandemic that we are dealing with. And so we only could pray that we find a way to move on from Dorian, because you still have a pandemic, you still have an upcoming hurricane season, and we don't know where this life is going to take us. I don't know. My hope, honestly, is for us to just find a way to move on. How do we do that? I don't know. If you are one who prays, then you have to constantly pray. You need a peace of mind, because I could tell you, I've been in that place. Even though I was numb for a long time, my mind was just running and racing. I speak to a mother who still doesn't have closure. Her daughter would have died in Dorian, and every time I talk to her, I hear the pain. We haven't received the closure that we've needed as yet. But through God, I don't know how we can move on. Honestly, I don't.
Well, the hope is that in sharing our stories, that we not only share the burden of our pain and of our loss and of our trauma, but also the hopefulness that things can be better and will be better, and the resilience of Bahamian people, the wonderful nature of their cooperative spirit, the preservation of their stories through their very vivid storytelling, is something that you have helped to preserve, not just for this generation, but for generations to come. So we hope that that is something that you can take pride in and that you find peace with. And on behalf of a grateful nation and a grateful people, we thank you for what you did and for what you're still doing.
Well, with that, let me add what the hope can be then. Honestly, I don't know, Crystal. I don't know. I don't know.
I think it's okay not to know.
The hope is then to say that we've been through the worst in terms of a hurricane. We've been through the worst of the worst.
That we will never see anything like Dorian again.
We pray that we never see anything like Dorian again. But the fact that we've been through this unprecedented storm, the hope is that moving forward, we would have learned something along the way.
What do you think?
Whether it is
What do you think we would have learned?
to be a better friend,
Dorian taught us.
to be a better neighbor, to realize that even with all the money, if you have all the money in the world, that couldn't save you. I saw it firsthand. You needed ordinary people, the same people you pass by sometimes and don't speak to. You needed your Bahamian brothers and sisters to risk their lives so that you may have yours. So the hope is that we become a better people, that we love each other a little more, that we realize that yellow, red, green in the grand scheme of things, those political colors mean absolutely nothing. That we, that would be the hope, that we take away whatever it is from Dorian, whether it's to evacuate, to trust the local authorities, to love each other a little more, that we just become a better people as a result of it. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know what the hope is. I'm going to be honest with you.
I think that already your hope has been realized.
I hope so.
I
hope so.
I believe so. I think that we do love a little bit better, live together a little bit, better. And that when that political season comes around, which it will, that the frequency of those seasons are not as frequent as the hurricane season. And so that with that it's human nature to be divided,
right,
a difference of opinion,
but
that there's more that unites us than that which divides us. And I think Grand Bahamians and Abaconians, Bahamians at home and around the world, the international communities, rich people and poor people and powerful people and just everyday people have demonstrated that we can work together for good.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something for which all of us can be glad.
Mm-hmm.
Interview by Dr. Crystal A. DeGregory, April 2021. Funding for this interview was provided by the International Organization for Migration Bahamas. Dorian and Beyond, battered but not broken. For more information, please visit us online at www.dorianandbeyond.org.